Hey everyone, this presentation will cover philosophies of punishment, which are talked about in chapter 10 of the textbook. So I want to start out by just talking about what punishment is from kind of an academic or philosophical context. So societies use a variety of methods to maintain social order. We call them sanctions, and these sanctions exist specifically to establish and maintain the power of the state or the government or whatever body is in control of the society itself. They use sanctions to reinforce cultural norms and values and to regulate behaviors in society. Now, when we're talking about sanctions, these can be positive sanctions or negative sanctions. I think the general tendency for most of us is to think about sanctions in a negative sense, but there are also positive sanctions, meaning that when you do something, there is going to be potentially a response to it that is either going to reinforce the behavior and encourage you to continue to repeat it, or to discourage that behavior and encourage you not to repeat it later on. So the positive sanction is something that is a reward of sorts that will encourage you to repeat that behavior that is appropriate or expected of you. So let's say you go out into society and you hold the door for somebody and they say thank you. That would be a very small positive sanction to reinforce that behavior. Or you may do something to help a person in need and might get like a social reward or recognition. That would be a positive sanction. Negative sanctions are any sort of punishment or consequence that comes of your choice that is not considered appropriate. So it could be just a reprimand, it could be a dirty look, it could be being kicked out of a venue or whatever, but that's the negative consequence. And these sanctions can be formal or informal. So within society, we reinforce behavior through both means. I think the biggest one we use is informal sanctions. These are the things that we experience on a day-to-day basis just through moving through society. So again, like I gave you examples of before, it may be how people respond to you, facial expressions, meaningful gestures or critical gestures, things like that. Those would be informal sanctions. It could also be within like a family group or a peer group. They may criticize you. You may be, kicked out of the group for a while or whatever. Formal sanctions are those that are imposed upon you through formal institutions in society, and for our purposes, the criminal justice system. And so a negative sanction that is like punishment that is coming through the criminal justice process is going to be a formal negative sanction. And that is what I think most of us are familiar with when we think about punishment and the role of the criminal justice system. Now, the interesting thing, at least to me, because I'm a nerd, is that there is inherently an understanding that there are going to be informal negative sanctions associated with formal punishments that are carried out through the criminal justice system. That we'll talk about that in a minute. But so the two are interconnected. Now, as I just said, punishment is typically considered a negative sanction and can be administered through formal and informal means, but for our purposes, we're going to be looking at the criminal justice system. So now, why do we punish? What is the goal of punishment? What's it for? Why do we do it? And this is where the philosophies of punishment are useful to answer that question. And these philosophies of punishment are kind of guiding sets of ideas and beliefs that determine how and why we use punishment, what forms of punishment we're using, and what outcomes we're expecting to gain from the use of those sanctions and punishments. And so I'll talk about each one of these individually. So the first one I'll talk about is retribution. And I think we kind of talked about this a little bit before earlier in the class, but retributive punishment is the earliest philosophy or perspective of punishment that we recognize within human societies. For our purposes, we really look at early pre-Enlightenment culture in Western Europe, Great Britain, or what became Great Britain later on. And these early retributive punishments were often grounded in religious beliefs and doctrines, superstitions, but largely religious doctrines. And we kind of talked about this in, I think it was chapter 4, when we talked about theories of crime and the pre-Enlightenment era. During this period, the purpose of punishment was vengeance, to get even with somebody. And there are a couple of concepts that are tied to that. One is in the book. I'm not sure if this other one is. I don't remember offhand. Lex talionis is the Latin phrase for basically vengeance, or kind of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of thing, or the punishment should equal the harm. The other is called just deserts, and yes, it's only one S, because it's a word that is derived from the word deserve. You're getting what you deserve. Both of these concepts recognize the idea that if you do harm to somebody, then you deserve to have a similar harm given back to you in response to that. And this was applied formally and informally. So in formal settings, the government would use retributive punishment as a means to reinforce and maintain social power. And these punishments often used a lot of physical pain, torture, very brutal punishments. I posted a video clip on D2L for you to watch, talking about the execution of Guy Fawkes. And if you're not familiar with Guy Fawkes, they'll give you a background in that. But the goal of this was to, again, reinforce the power of the state and maintain the supremacy of the government and its leadership. And so punishments were used, or let me back up, crimes were viewed as often viewed as actions against the legitimacy of the government itself. And so any action that was perceived to be trying to undermine the power of the state or the power of the ruler, that was seen as an extraordinarily serious crime. And so the only logical response under this retributive model for such a serious offense was a seriously horrible punishment. Now, in informal settings, retributive punishment was seen as part and parcel with getting justice for your relative or community member or something like that. And we talked about that previously as well, where if you were wronged in some way, it was responsible for you and your family or your community to collectively go out and seek vengeance and get justice on your behalf. And it was not uncommon for the offender's family to view these acts of vengeance as excessive. And so then they would go back and try to get even, and this would go back and forth and lead to blood feuds that could go on for years, where people were violently attacked and murdered or killed in a back and forth tit for tat kind of thing, in an effort to kind of get and maintain justice. Okay. And so these were the examples of how retribution existed in society prior to the Enlightenment. But starting in the late 1600s, when Enlightenment era thought became more commonplace, deterrence began to evolve as the dominant philosophy as a response to the problems with retribution and vengeance. And so at this point, the role of punishment was to deter crime or future offending. And if you recall back to, I think it's chapter 4, classical theory is based on this idea that crime is a choice, and we choose to commit crime through the hedonistic rationality that we are pleasure-seeking people. We do everything we can to maximize pleasure while avoiding pain and displeasure as much as possible. And we choose to commit a crime after weighing the risks and the rewards, right? And so punishment then becomes something that is going to deter criminal behavior by raising the risk side of the equation to the degree that it's not worth you taking the risk to commit the crime, because if you're caught, then the punishment will be sufficient enough that it's not worth it. And so deterrence works in two ways. There's specific deterrence, where the punishment itself is intended to be problematic and painful to the individual offender and encourage them not to repeat their behavior in the future because they don't want to have that same punishment or similar punishment again. And then there's the general deterrent effect, that people in society will see the punishment being administered, recognize that this is a potential consequence for similar behavior, and they will also choose not to engage in that same criminal behavior later on. Now, for punishment to work under this model, it has to have three characteristics. The punishment needs to be swift, it needs to be certain, and it needs to be proportional. It needs to happen as soon after the criminal act as practicable, so that there's a clear connection between the punishment and the bad behavior. It needs to be certain so that everyone knows that if you do this particular crime, this is the particular punishment that's going to be coming after the fact if you're caught. And it needs to be proportional. The punishment needs to be harsh enough that it outweighs the potential benefits of the actual crime itself, but can't be too harsh so that it kind of undermines the legitimacy of the system itself. The book, and I've mentioned this before, the book lists severity as a feature of this, and that is incorrect. And I believe I talked about it back in chapter 4 in classical theory and presented the direct quote from Beccaria's writings on this that specifically said that the punishment shouldn't be too severe. It needs to be proportional. So please don't read the book and get that burned into your brain. And this is a common mistake, but I assure you I've read that pretty extensively, and it is most definitely proportionality and not severity. Now, moving forward in time, the rehabilitative model, or rehabilitative philosophy, began to take hold during the mid-1800s. So we talked about the positivist era of crime theory, and rehabilitation was the criminal justice response to that. And that remained the dominant philosophy through most of the 20th century. And the rehabilitative model was based on the notion that people who commit crime, or people in general, but offenders, are individuals with unique biological, psychological, cognitive, social, and cultural traits, and that those things have an influence over our behavior, why we choose to commit crime, what's going on in our minds when we do it, whatever. And that if we could scientifically understand behavior, then we could individualize our approach to dealing with offenders and rehabilitate them with the hope of, quote-unquote, fixing them so that we prevent recidivism in the future. That if we recognize that a person has committed a crime and it was because they were They didn't have uh, proper guidance in childhood, or they didn't have a strong work ethic, or they didn't have marketable job skills, and were low income, or whatever. Then we could fix that somehow, and through that process, we could um, prevent crime in the future. And so, under this rehabilitative model, indeterminate sentencing was the norm. And the chapter talks about this, where the offender was given a range of sentence with the possibility of an early release at some point through demonstrating good behavior and showing that they have been rehabilitated, that they're able to now return to society and be a productive, law-abiding person in our community. So I don't know how many of you have seen Shawshank Redemption. It's an amazing movie. If you haven't seen it, I highly encourage it. In it, this model of rehabilitative corrections and indeterminate sentencing and the use of early release and parole and things like that is a central feature to the film. And again, this was the model through most of the 20th century. But that began to change starting in the 1970s. And during that period, or starting in the 1970s, the incapacitation model became the dominant approach to punishment in society, or in American society. And it continues to be the dominant one through contemporary times. And this incapacitative model evolved out of some historical events, some political response to those events, as well as some research that came out, which I'll talk about here in a second. So a few things was happening during the 1960s and early 1970s. In society, you had the counterculture movement with kind of the hippie generation and the increase in casual drug use and casual sex and things like that, and kind of the abandonment of dominant social norms and values that had, been the norm through, since the early 20th century. That rejection of those norms and values was problematic for many in society at the time. Tied to that was social unrest. So you had the Vietnam War protests, and you had a lot of unrest tied to the civil rights movement. And so there was a perception in society that social order was kind of beginning to collapse or come apart at the seams, because now you had all these hippies going out here, and you had motorcycle gangs who were people coming back from World War II, and they started the motorcycle gangs, and you had increases in drug use, and you had civil rights related marches and riots and protests and all this stuff going on. And at the same time, there was also an increase in violent crime across the country. In fact, some of the highest rates of violent crime in U.S. history happened in the early 1970s. So in response to that, political leaders began to call for a more aggressive approach to crime, law and enforcement of law and order sort of things. And then in the late 70s, an academic paper was published by an author. His last name was Martinson. And in it, he did what's called a meta-analysis, which is where he looked at a large collection of research papers that were examining the effectiveness of rehabilitative programs and corrections. And in it, he said that when you take all of these as a whole, you find that nothing works. None of these work. That we're investing money in programs that don't work. And so the nothing works doctrine came out of this. Now, there's kind of a tragic irony to this, is that the Martinson paper went on to say that even though these programs, when looked at as a whole, collectively, don't appear to work, there are aspects of some of these programs that do show some promise. And basically the argument was, instead of focusing on what we're doing, we should pick the ones that do work and focus on those instead. But that idea of the nothing works piece of it really fit in with the social narrative and the political narrative of the day. And as a result, there was a shift, a pretty dramatic shift in how we viewed the role of punishment and corrections in our society. And at that point, things began to be, the correctional system and punishment began to be used as more of an incapacitation method. How do we segregate offenders from law-abiding people in society? How do we contain them? How do we incapacitate them so they cannot reoffend physically? And so if we can't deter them and we can't rehabilitate them, we can at least restrict their freedom to the degree that they cannot reoffend again while we have control over them. And so incarceration became used more prominently. Rehabilitative programs began to be de-emphasized quite a bit. Community corrections was used more frequently, and the conditions for community release were much more strict. And so this is when you see things like determinate sentencing, where now there's no longer a range of sentences. You are given a specific sentence that you have to serve that is deemed to be appropriate for the severity of your crime. And then we had mandatory minimum sentencing that came along, which said that depending on your criminal history and the severity of your crime and things like that, that you had to serve at least a minimum number of years before you were eligible for parole. So even if there was an indeterminate sentence implied, there was a mandatory minimum that had to be given, period. There were also a number of enhanced sentences that have been passed. Examples of these would be like the three strikes laws, where if you are convicted of a third felony in your lifetime, you automatically got life in prison. There's some states also have what are called 10 and 20 life laws or something similar to that, where basically if you commit a felony and you're armed with a firearm, you automatically get 10 years no matter what. If you brandished the firearm or discharged it in some way, you automatically got a 20-year sentence. And if you harmed somebody directly by shooting them, you automatically got a life sentence no matter what. And those are examples of those enhanced sentences. And the outcome of all of this has been what has been recognized as hyperincarceration. And we'll talk about this more in the next chapter, but the United States, our correctional population is the highest of any, as far as per capita, is the highest of any country in the world. So that's kind of what we've been seeing since the 1970s. In response to all of this, there has been the development of the restoration philosophy. And we kind of talked about this with restorative justice earlier. And clearly restorative justice is a product of the restoration philosophy. And this evolved out of various justice reform movements in the 1960s and 70s. So these were happening at the same time that the incapacitation and get tough on crime mentality was coming about. And this perspective does draw on historical, religious, and indigenous traditions related to forgiveness and the need for community-based responses to crime and social harms that lead to crime. That crime is essentially a social or community problem, and as such, it requires community-based efforts to address the needs of offenders and victims in pursuit of preventing crime in the future. And so for this, the goals of the restorative approach in punishment is to encourage accountability for the offender's actions. The offender needs to accept accountability for their behavior and acknowledge that they caused harm, and that through this process, they can help repair harm that they did cause to whatever degree is possible, right? You also need to address the needs of the offender as well as the victim. We talked about the victim more previously in the victim chapter or victimization chapter. And that there needs to be a community-based response to the offender so that community can provide services and support that are needed for the offender to be rehabilitated and not reoffend. And then through this, we promote successful reintegration. And so what we've recognized that our society does a really good job with stigmatizing offenders. It's called stigmatic shaming. That if you're accused of a crime, we do a really, really good job of symbolically and practically stigmatizing you, labeling you an offender, treating you as an offender, segregating you from society, making sure that the community knows that you have done bad things, but we have done a really, really poor job of reintegrating people into society. So, in other words, we talk about how, well, once you've paid your debt to society, you have an opportunity to return to the community and be a productive member of society, but we haven't really done a very good job of actually living that philosophy, right? And so the idea of reintegrative shaming is that to effectively restore a person to society, that we need to go through a similar process of reintegrating them, showing that they've accepted responsibility, showing that they've taken their accepted accountability, that they've made efforts to repair harm, that they've done things to try to restore themselves to the good graces of society. And so that is a big part of this restorative approach to when dealing with offenders. And again, the primary goal of this is to reduce recidivism after all of this. So when you look at modern day, contemporary approaches to punishment, you will see examples of each of these philosophical approaches in our correctional system and in our criminal justice system. Retribution still exists. From a policy standpoint, a strong argument is made that capital punishment is an artifact of that it's like you commit the most serious offense, you deserve to lose your life. You kill someone, you deserve to lose your life as a punishment, right? That is clearly a retributive idea right there. Also, culturally and politically, there's a call for harsher punishments, if for no other reason than just to get even with offenders and cause as much discomfort as possible, or as much inconvenience or unpleasantness as possible, right? You'll see similar comments culturally about people who commit crimes against children. Yeah, put them in jail and let the other prisoners deal with them. That's very much a retributive mindset. And I say that in a value neutral way. That's reflective of this old idea of retribution. We also definitely use deterrence in our correctional system, in our punishment. So things like public displays of the offender's actions. So we put them on TV. We put their faces and their names in the newspaper. We publish flyers. We have sex offender registries. We have public labor or prison labor, where we have offenders sitting on the side of the road in orange jumpsuits or striped jumpsuits to show that they've committed crimes, things like that. And all of this is intended to help deter criminal behavior, and probably a bit of retribution in that as well. But rehabilitation is still present in our use of punishment. We have prison education programs, job training programs, mental health, mandatory counseling and mental health treatment for offenders, things like that. Addiction treatment, There's noticed in the PowerPoint here I put addition treatment. You make them do math. No, it meant to say addiction, substance abuse treatment. So those things still exist. We definitely use incapacitation, as I already mentioned, with these increased rates of incarceration, longer sentences, and capital punishment is primarily a means of incapacitation because once you no longer are alive, you're no longer able to commit crime. And then the restorative approach is used in the correctional system to some extent. It's more prominent in some areas than others, but we talked about this a bit, but restorative programs for offenders. We have victim offender mediation programs. Restorative approaches are used much more commonly in schools and in juvenile justice settings. And we also in society have early childhood programs for at-risk youth and families that are trying to address these community-based factors that lead to crime later in life. And this restorative philosophy has inspired the current, what's called the transformative justice movement, which is trying to take restorative justice a step further and go more deeply in addressing the root causes of crime in society. So things like economic inequalities, substance abuse, lack of access to mental health treatment, substance abuse therapies, things like that, with the goal of transforming social institutions and social structures in ways that are more likely to reduce crime in the future. So all of these exist and will likely continue to exist in the future. And so, yeah, just to wrap it up here, our current approach to punishment is the outcome of an evolutionary process, and it continues to be influenced by historical and cultural changes, and that's not going to change anytime soon. And judges are individuals in the court system that have to basically implement whatever punishment and sentencing structures that are placed before them by the legislative bodies that control our laws. So I hope this is helpful in understanding the rest of the content in this chapter, and we'll set you up for what comes down the line in the next chapter or two. Let me know if you have any questions at all.